Hi everyone, hope we're all well. Big game tomorrow against Rangers, we know all this. Not going to talk about it on today's video. We did do the big preview with Jackie McNamara and John from the channel. We spoke about our team that would play for the game. We spoke about how big the game is, what we're hoping to see, all that kind of stuff. So that's linked above, check that out. For now though, we're going to continue a recent trend on the channel, in these solo videos anyway, of deviating slightly from the issues everyone's talking about. Got a wee bit more niche and discussing potential things that Celtic could do in the future. I must confess to having enjoyed myself a little bit on Thursday night as Rangers were dumped out of the Europa League against Slavia Prague. Before that, I also enjoyed myself, not quite as much, but still enjoyed myself as Dinamo Zagreb thumped Spurs 3-0 to put them out of Europe for the season. And one thing that struck me looking at both Prague and Zagreb is that these are clubs that we should at the very least be able to replicate, and we should probably be better than. We're bigger than both of those clubs by far, and when you see the success they've had in both the Champions League and the Europa League in recent seasons, it definitely gives you food for thought. And one thing that also caught my eye while I was watching the two teams I've mentioned was the amount of players in each side from that country, and it got me thinking whether Celtic have enough Scottish players and whether we've signed enough Scottish players over the year. So I've done a bit of research and this is what I found. So Celtic made 7 signings this season. Only one of them was Scottish or from a Scottish club. That was, of course, David Turnbull. Last season, we made 12 what I would call first team signings. And again, only one of them was either Scottish or was signed from a Scottish club, Greg Taylor. Brendan Rodgers made 30 signings in his, I think, 6 transfer windows. Only 4 of them were Scottish. They were Scott Bain, Jack Hendry, Oliver Burke and Lewis Morgan. He did also sign Yusuf Malumbu and Johnny Hayes from other Scottish clubs, but 6 out of 30 is what, a fifth, if my maths is correct. That's not a hell of a lot. Overall, only 8 of the last 50 signings that Celtic have made have been for either Scottish players or have been signed from a Scottish club. So how does that compare to other sides? It's probably a bit unfair to bring any other Scottish teams into the equation at this stage because there's such a gulf between playing for a lesser Scottish team, then going to a Celtic or a Rangers, if we're honest. Whereas, Aberdeen signing a player from St Mirren is less of a gulf. So it's probably unfair to mention any other Scottish teams, but I will bring Slavia Prague and Dinamo Zagreb into things. Slavia Prague signed 10 players in the summer. 5 of them were from the Czech Republic. 4 players from the Czech Republic started in their win over Ibrox, while the entire bench, strangely enough, all 8 players were from the Czech Republic. Dinamo Zagreb, meanwhile, had 7 of their 11 starters from Croatia. They then had 6 further players on the bench from Croatia. In total, they signed 9 Croatian players last summer, while 7 of them were signed from lesser Croatian clubs. Now, I'm not for 1 minute putting down the success of teams like Dinamo Zagreb and Slavia Prague in reaching the last 8 of the Europa League down to the fact that they've got loads of domestic players. I really don't think that is the key issue, or probably even in the top 5 or 6 key issues at the club. Obviously other things like their tactics, the general playing squad they've got, their manager, the way they set up and are suited to Europe probably matters a lot more than that. But I do think it is interesting to note how many more domestic based players these teams seem to sign every summer in comparison to Celtic. Just remember, this season 1 out of 7, the previous season 1 out of 12. But it hasn't always been like this for Celtic. If we go back a decade and a half to Gordon Strachan's time at the club, he signed so many players from other Scottish teams. We signed 4 in total from Hibs. We signed 2 from Dundee United. We signed 2 from Hearts. We also signed players from the likes of Motherwell and even Inverness Caledonian Thistle. Included in those players were guys who maybe weren't the flashiest but went on to be really good servants for the club. I'm talking like Barry Robson, Mark Wilson, Gary Caldwell, Paul Hartley, Scott McDonald was a good player for Celtic, and of course our current captain was signed from Hibs. You could argue that probably only Mark Brown and Chris Killen were real flops signed out of that bunch. Even Derek Riordan gave us some good moments and was perhaps harshly treated at the club. So is the Scottish League really so much weaker nowadays than it was back when Gordon Strachan was the manager and signed so many players from other teams? Or more importantly, are other teams just not producing the same amount of players? Is Scottish football as a whole not producing the same amount of quality players? Well, I would argue that it is, and if anything, it's probably producing more now than it was 6 or 7 years ago. You look at the amount of players that we've missed out on, that have gone down south for fees that we could afford and have gone on to have really good times of it down south. Now, obvious one that's always mentioned is John Mcginn. We know about Celtic's interest there. He went to Villa for a fee that we could certainly have afforded. We should have signed him. Another one that no one really ever talks about is Andy Robertson, who left Dundee United for Hull for around about £2 million. Ryan Fraser, another one, he went for about £500,000. He left Aberdeen not too long ago, has gone on to have a really good career down south. Would have been a great player for us to catch. Lesser players, the likes of Johnny Russell and Scott McKenna, have gone in the last few years. Even Lyndon Dykes last summer went for a fee that we could have afforded. Now, I know he's struggled a bit, and I know you may be turning your nose up a little bit at the fact that some of these players wouldn't have been good enough to cut it at Celtic, but when we signed the likes of Gary Caldwell and Scott McDonald, can you really say they were at a much higher level than the kind of players we've missed out on in recent years? Celtic can do it though. We signed David Turnbull, admittedly with a bit of fuss due to medicals, but Celtic's actual decision to sign David Turnbull was pretty clear, and we moved quite quickly, both the first summer and last summer. Greg Taylor as well was another player we identified. It was an obvious signing to make. I know the jury's still out in Greg Taylor, but I think he's been decent enough for us without being spectacular. Lewis Morgan was another signing that the club saw from a lesser provincial Scottish club, and they went and made that signing. But there's so many other ones out there in the league at the moment, and I just don't get the impression that Celtic are really interested in them. I could be wrong, but I look at a couple of players at Hibs. I look at Ryan Porteous, the centre-back, who I think could be a good signing long-term for Celtic. You look at them up front with Kevin Nisbet. For me, he just screams out like the perfect Lee Griffiths replacement. Again, a slightly unpopular one if you look at Aberdeen. Lewis Ferguson, I know he's got links to Rangers with his family members, but he's the kind of player that I think would certainly improve Celtic's squad, if not first team. But I just don't get the impression that we're going to sign these players. I feel like all of them will probably end up down south or worse at Rangers. They've shown a real want to sign these Scottish players over the last few years. Now, I know we've got the likes of Taylor and Turnbull, and you could argue they're of a higher calibre than the players Rangers have signed, the likes of Jordan Jones, Greg Stewart, Scott Wright, Kyle Lafferty in recent seasons. But it is a very obvious ploy from Rangers that we're not really doing as much. I know other Scottish clubs, the smaller clubs, will argue that it doesn't make much sense for Celtic to sign the best players from lesser clubs and then stick them on their bench. But from a Celtic point of view, when we've looked so threadbare this season, would it not make sense to sign a few more Scottish-based players, even if they're not necessarily going to be top stars for us? For me, when you look at so many of our signings failing to make it over the last couple of seasons, been signed from far-flung countries and maybe not adapting, maybe it's time for Celtic to go back to basics a bit and put more faith into Scottish signings.